That traditional Mexican song you're hearing, La Cucaracha, causes me to wonder, what do people do in their daily activities in Mexico? They can't really be dancing all the time, can they? This podcast will describe some of the common activities of children in Mexico. Students listening to this podcast can help their understanding by creating a list of their own favorite foods, games, and chores, and then later compare those to what's described in this podcast. At the end of the podcast, the teacher might ask you about conclusions you have reached, including how different or how similar are the students in Mexico to your own life. This podcast addresses the Minnesota Geography Standards for Grade 4, 4.3.2.3.1 and 4.3.2.4.2, and for 8th grade, 8.3.2.3.1. You're listening to a podcast created by the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Our mission is to help you understand your world better through geography. Our presenter is Kari Kunze Hogue, a master Spanish teacher at Mounds Park Academy in St. Paul. I am Fred Kunze, a member of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education.
Un elefante se columpiaba sobre la tela de araña. Como veía que resistía, fue llamar a otro elefante. Dos elefantes se columpiaban sobre la tela de araña. Como veía que resistía, fue llamar a otro elefante. That's a song that a typical child would sing in Mexico. It's very similar to the American 100 bottles of beer on the wall, but starting in reverse, starting with one elephant who wants to swing over a spider web, which of course would not be a very good idea for an elephant, but he couldn't resist, so he went to get another friend, and then they had two friends swinging over a spider web, and you continue counting up into infinity. But it's a very typical song that little children would sing in Mexico, especially when they're learning how to count from their parents. There are a lot of other things that kids do in Mexico. Mostly, they're similar to what kids in the United States like. They like to play with their friends. They like to hang out in the street. They like some sports. They like some music. They like good food. But there are some other things that they do are different too. One game that would be very different for a kid in Mexico would be the game called Loteria. It's a game that almost every Mexican child will have played at one time or another. It's somewhat similar to bingo in that you have a tabla, or a sheet of paper that has 8 different pictures on it. It's based on a pictogram. In each of these pictures, there's something that's associated with Mexican culture. In fact, you can learn a lot about Mexican culture by looking at what they've chosen to include in this game. But the person who's calling, instead of calling numbers, will then hold up a card that is associated with one of those pictures, and each of the cards is a little saying that goes along with it. In fact, the one for the sandia, or the watermelon, is La barriga que Juan tenía era empacho de sandía, which means Juan's swollen belly was due to eating too much watermelon. And so it's also a little bit of a lesson for kids in there too. Just like with bingo, the first child to have 4 across or 4 down, or if it's a bigger loteria game, it could be more like 6, is the winner. Children in Mexico go to school just like they do in the United States. It is more common, however, in Mexico to go to a private school than it is in the United States. The Mexican education system is largely dependent on the government, and sometimes the government isn't as organized in how it pays its bills as the United States government is, and so there are a lot of teacher strikes. And so most middle-class families, if they're able to, and upper-class families, will send their children to a private school where they're less dependent on government funding. That means that most kids in Mexico wear a uniform to school. Every school has a different-looking uniform, and so around 1:30 when kids get out of school for the day, you'll see the streets filled with different children in uniforms, and you can tell which school they attend based on how they're dressed. Now, you may think it's unusual that a child gets out of school at 1:30 in the afternoon, which seems very early to us. But in Mexico, it is still common that everybody goes home for la comida, or the main meal of the day, which is lunch, and they eat that from around 2 to 4 o'clock. That doesn't mean they sit at the table for 2 hours, but rather that the whole family gathers at 2 o'clock for a meal that is usually home cooked, and they'll sit around and discuss the day afterwards. At some point in there, they may sit down and watch a soccer game that's on TV, rest, read a book, or get ready to go back to school to go do some after-school activities. Their day typically starts much earlier than ours do. At 1:30, when the kids are dismissed from school, as they're walking home to go back for la comida, it is very typical that if you live in a large city, you will stop at one of the catedrales, or one of the cathedrals, because there the nuns will be cutting out the communion wafers. And you don't get to eat the communion wafers because they're going to be used by the priests in a mass. Most of Mexico, 97%, is Roman Catholic. But there's something called the recortes, the parts that are left when you cut out the little communion wafers that they sell to children. If you can think of making sugar cookies and you cut all your cookies out and then you've got the form around it left that will turn into a ball and then make more cookies out of, when you're making a communion wafer, it's not dough, so you can't do that. That's the recorte. It tastes a lot like popcorn. They'll put it into little bags and the kids line up outside of the nun's doorway and they'll pay a peso or two to get a little bag of recortes to eat as they walk home. Other foods that kids like are very common to find in the market. For instance, in Morelia, which is the capital city of the state of Michoacan, it is famous for its Mercado de los Dulces, or sweet market. Michoacan is the largest producer of homemade candies out of all of Mexico, and they have one market entirely dedicated to candies. So children love to walk through this market and buy different little sugary items to eat. And then, of course, most kids, depending on where they live, will have some chores they do at home. If they live in the city, perhaps they'll help their mama prepare the comida or help clean the house. If they live in a rural area, they might help out in the farm. For instance, in Michoacan, which is a city or state very similar to Minnesota, it's very agricultural. The kids might have chores out in the cornfields like they would in the United States.
You have been listening to a production of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Background music is courtesy of Jim Hogue of Decorah, Iowa. The Minnesota Alliance is a nonprofit group of educators and other parties who are interested in promoting an enhanced understanding of our world through improved geographic literacy.